I'm sure you've seen plenty of Traptrix videos already, but you're not going to want to miss this one. In today's video, I'm going to be going over essentially a complete guide to Traptrix, showing you a sample deck list, and I'm also going to be showing the playstyle of the deck, choke points, as well as how to beat it, and then tips and things to remember for key Traptrix cards. So be sure to stick to the very end to see all those. The timestamps will be in the description below, so you can skip ahead to different sections. But we're going to start things off with just the sample deck list, and this deck list is just made up of 3 structure decks. The reason being, the core engine is going to stay the same even if you choose to upgrade it. It's just sort of the non-engine slots that are changing between them. So we're going to start things off with 3 copies of Traptrix Pudica. I'm not going to bother explaining what these do because I'm sure you've already seen them by now. But yeah, 3 copies of Pudica, 3 copies of Mermelio. This is all pretty standard, especially for the $30 budget build. There isn't too much room for innovation, so we're just maxing out on all the good Traptrix monsters. So Arachnocampa at 3 as well, and 2 copies of Dionea. Yeah, this one's also pretty standard at 2. It's great to special summon off of Sarah, but you don't necessarily want to see in your opening hand because it doesn't do anything. And then of course we're playing 3 copies of Ash Blossom. Not much to say about that. The only hand trap that's mainable in the structure deck, and 3 copies of Raigeki. So of course, if you are playing like a non-budget build, this is going to be something else, like either hand traps or other extenders like Parallel Exceed. But for the purpose of the budget build, like, yeah, this is one of your best going second cards, so you gotta play it. And 3 Trap Tantalizing Tunes, so similar to Raigeki, you just switch styles for something better once you have access to it and you're able to upgrade your deck. But for the budget build, this is actually pretty solid because it turns a lot of your bad hands, where it's either all traps or all monsters, into hopefully something better. It also helps you draw into like your Kaiju's Raigeki evenly matched when going second, and that's really important. And then 1 copy of Traptrick Garden. This is still pretty standard at 1. You don't really need more than this. And then for the traps, of course, we're playing triple evenly matched. This is just the best one. Going second card, and of course there's a normal trap, so you can use it with a card like Traptrix Holotea as well. Not much to say about that there. And then for the other one of trap holes, like playing 1-on-1, this is important because of course Fallen of Albaz is a pretty big thing. You don't want them to fusion deployment out Albaz or normal summon it. Another big thing people don't mention is that if you have Rafflesia up and your opponent normal summons Denko, well, Rafflesia can send bottomless and gets rid of the Denko. So it also helps you play around Denko Sekka, so I think it's important to have this one. Of course, Gravediggers is to help you play around hand traps and Nibiru most likely. 2 Terrifying Trap Hole. I think this one's also great. You could make an argument for playing 3, but I didn't really find that there's worth cutting anything in the main deck, so I think 2 of this is okay. And then Triple Floodgate. This is just the most generic one. It's good against like pretty much every deck because all the decks are going to summon. And then being able to book like against Cashiers without them being able to flip it up is just insane. And then finally, 3 copy of Traptrix Trapple Nightmare. Not much to say about that. So that's it for the main deck. 40 cards, just a very quick sample. Of course, Traptrix are going to be playing 3 copies of Sarah. This is the one you're playing 3 like essentially no matter what. Not much to really explain about this. This card's just insane. Just what makes the deck actually good. I am deciding to play 2 copies of Clarius, so I don't want to play like one-ofs in the sample deck list for the budget build because you don't want to lose to Cashier just ripping out one of them and just not having access to it for the rest of the game. Like, even though like most of these won't ever come up in multiples, like it's still important I think to have at least one. So that's why we're playing 2 of those. 3 Adipus, like you can definitely cut this down to 2 and play 3 of an XYZ, but like I said, this is just the sample deck list to give you an idea of the stuff they're working with. And of course, if you're playing a non-budget build, like you'd replace those multiples of like Kalari and Adipus with like other XYZs or something. 3 copies of Rafflesia though. This card's incredible. It's something you end on, but also like it gives protection to your other Traptrix, which a lot of people seem to forget. So it can be very good for protecting cards like your Sarah, which are very small. And then 2 copies of Pingicula. Not much to say about this either. Of course, like I said with Kalari, you just always want to have access to at least one of them. And then 2 copies of Alamaris. And once again, like you are switching out extra copies of these cards for better like XDs or something if you have access to them. So that's it for the sample deck list, and now we're gonna move on to sort of the general playstyle of the deck. Alright, so for the general playstyle of the deck, a lot of its plays are going to center around having Traptrix Sarah on the board and gaining advantage through that, because Traptrix Sarah essentially during both players' turn gets you 2 additional cards whenever you activate a Traptrix monster or a trap hole or a normal trap card. You're going to be able to get more advantage, and that's sort of the goal of this deck, to be able to trigger Sarah during both turns. So in your very first turn, a lot of your best normal summons like Mantis or Myrmelio plus like Pudica are going to be able to trigger your Traptrix Sarah right away. So what I mean by that, just very simply with a card like Traptrix Mantis. Let's say you normal summon Mantis, Mantis grabs Arachnocampa. Arachnocampa is good because it gives you the extra level 4 body, but also triggers Sarah since you're using a monster effect. So you can link off whatever you summon for Sarah right away, special summon out the Arachnocampa or something, activate the Sarah to set a trap hole, and then from there, if you have another normal trap in your hand, like these are the best types of hands because you're going to be able to set Holotea. Holotea is going to be able to get rid of like a normal trap in your hand, special summon itself, so that's another level 4 body. But perhaps more importantly, Sarah gets a trigger since you did use a trap hole effect. So you're going to be able to special summon out any one of your Traptrix monsters. So a lot of times, like you're going to find if you discard a trap hole, you're going to want to go for Dionea because Dionea is going to just be able to reset the trap hole. So that's sort of like the basic turn 1 play. And then if you don't have let's say you have to discard a card like Evenly Matched and you don't have a trap hole in your graveyard, then if you need to trigger Sarah again, you can special summon Myrmelio. And then what Myrmelio's actually does to trigger Sarah is its effect is mandatory. So even if your opponent has no spells and traps, it still activates. And that means you can trigger Sarah to set a trap hole or something. So that you would go for Myrmelio in the case where you didn't discard a trap hole off of Holotea. So that's how to actually trigger the Sarah on the first turn. But then in terms of like actual first turn boards, like just keeping it simple, a lot of the times you're going to end on like Sarah plus like a rank 4 or something. And that's already actually pretty strong, plus like a bunch of back row. So the rank 4 you go for is pretty important. I would say like 9 times out of 10, the rank 4 you're going to go for is Rafflesia. The reason being, it gives you flexibility as to which trap hole you're able to use, but also gives protection to your Sarah. So Sarah is, like I said, is the key card to this deck, and it's going to be generating you advantage every single turn. So being able to protect it from targeting, battle, and destruction is pretty good. And Rafflesia is, like, of course, very hard to out, being 2500, but also backed up with all your trap cards. Like, your opponent's just not going to be able to do anything, essentially. And when you do activate Rafflesia effect, you always want to detach Holotea. Holotea essentially can only be used, like one effect can only be used during each turn, so you want to make the most out of it. So like you want to be using one effect of it every single turn since this card is so good. So on your opponent's turn, when you detach a card like Holotea, let's say assuming you have a Traptrix monster in your graveyard, so like a card like Myrmelio or Pudica are the best ones, because if you started with these and like you link these off for Sarah, now they're in your graveyard, once you get Holotea in the graveyard, that's an extra layer of disruption in addition to your back row, because Holotea is going to be able to banish itself during your opponent's turn, special summon out any one of these. That's gonna of course trigger their effects either to banish a monster or pop a spell or trap. That's an additional interruption, which is honestly super good. Gives you a level 4 extender for next turn as well. And at that time, if you hadn't used Sarah already, like there's your Sarah trigger. You're able to set a trap. And then of course, like with all your trap cards, like when you're flipping them up, you can use the Sarah to special one from your deck. A lot of the times, I think it is just going to be Dionea again, or Myrmelio if you need an extra spell or trap pop. So that's sort of like the general game plan of the deck when going first. It's just set up Sarah, set up your back row, constantly use Holotea every turn. So like, if you have like enough trap cards already, like off of Sarah, you're probably setting another Holotea just to do it again during the next turn, and your opponent's just not going to be able to keep up with you at that point. So yeah, that's it for the general playstyle of the deck when going first, essentially. Going second, it is a little bit difficult, especially with a budget build, because you don't have access to key rank 4s like Evil Storm, Exciton Knight, but nonetheless, this deck does have a lot of options. Alright, so next up, we're going to be going over some of the choke points of the deck and how you're actually going to be able to beat the deck. So right in front of you, you see 2 of the deck's main normal summons as well as Arachnocampa, and the reason I separated these is because usually these 2 can be considered as the choke points for the deck when they normal summon it. So what do I mean? Let's start with Pudica. When you normal summon Pudica, its effect is going to grab you Traptrick Garden, and Traptrick Garden, the relevant effect in this case is that you get an additional normal summon during your main phase for a Traptrix monster. So that means if you have Pudica plus like another normal summon Traptrix is incredibly good, because then you're able to make Sarah trigger the Sarah, and you have Traptrick Garden on the board. So stopping Pudica can actually be pretty good, because if you, let's say, like Imperm or Ash the Pudica, your opponent essentially has to have either hard drawn their one of Traptrick Garden, or they have to have an Arachnocampa to special out to actually be able to keep playing up. So if you're able to stop the Pudica, then your opponent, essentially all they're going to be able to do is just make a Sarah, set some cards, and pass. And that's not that bad for you, because you're essentially just playing against like trap pools that sometimes trade 1-for-1, and Sarah's going to be able to special summon one monster from the deck. But it's also important to note that like being able to just use up Imperm early, I think, is important, because like all the Traptrix extra deck monsters are effectively unaffected by trap cards. So if you're able to stop like the normal summons like Pudica or Mantis, then yeah, you're in a great spot, being able to prevent them from getting to that rank 4, and being able to trigger Sarah first turn. That's sort of the most important choke point. If they don't trigger Sarah first turn, they don't get too far ahead, and you're still able to catch up. So moving on to Mantis now. Mantis is the same idea as Pudica. If you're able to like Imperm or Ash the Mantis, like they once again have to hard draw one of these to be able to keep playing, essentially, and trigger Sarah during the first turn. Being able to stop these normal summons before they get going is also really good. Another thing you want to look out for is Holotea. You just want to make sure that your opponent can't get max value off the Holotea. So what I mean is, of course, when it's in the graveyard and you're playing into their Traptrix board, if you have cards that can like banish stuff from the graveyard or like be Tcg shufflers, you do want to get rid of cards like Myrmelio and Pudica, because those are the best ones to summon back. And then finally, perhaps like the most general weakness of Traptrix is just like their traps don't really do anything to establish boards already. That's the first thing. If you have monsters on the board already, it's going to be very difficult for them to actually use their traps effectively to actually break any sort of board, as long as you're not like recommitting stuff onto the board. So like, for example, if your opponent does sets like a bunch of cards, makes Sarah and then Rafflesia, and they're going second, like what you can do is you can honestly just go battle, like kill these first if you have your established board, and then that takes away like essentially all the advantage they can get, and then their trap pools just aren't that great against you after that. So going second, definitely a key weakness of this deck. But also, just perhaps the most general is it's a trap deck at the end of the day. So it does potentially lose to big board breakers if you don't have access to Arachnocampa. Arachnocampa does have the effect to protect your set cards once per turn, so cards like Feather Duster and stuff aren't always that great if your opponent has access to this. Same with Lightning Storm. A lot of times you're going to be facing against evenly matched to break the boards. A quick tip about Arachnocampa though, like if you know your opponent has Arachnocampa and you have quick play removal like Twin Twisters, you can just go like draw phase or standby phase, use the Twin Twisters and pop it if they decide to keep this in hand. Because a lot of players will, either to play around Nibiru or to play around a card like Dark Ruler or Book of Eclipse, so this stays in their hand at the end of the day. So if you're able to punish them by just Twin Twistering their stuff before they can summon this out, since it can only summon itself out during the main phase. Alright, so to summarize essentially how to beat Traptrix, you want to prevent them from getting advantage off of Sarah turn 1, and that can be by stopping their normal summons like Mantis or Pudica. You also want to be able to make sure that their Holotea doesn't get as much value as it can by removing stuff from their graveyard. 3, you want to make sure that you're able to punish them for not keeping Arachnocampa on the board by using your destruction cards like Twin Twisters during the standby phase or something. And you also finally want to remember at the end of the day, like it is a trap deck, so like going second is a big weakness. Also, their trap cards don't really do anything to an established board already, so just keep that in mind. You want to clear out their Sarah or something first before you summon anything, so they can't gain advantage off of their trap pools. So essentially that's going to do it for how to beat, generally how to beat Traptrix. And now I'm going to be going over some things to remember and tips about key Traptrix cards. And this is important because it can also give you insight as to how to counter them, but also how to utilize them properly if you are playing the Traptrix strategy. Alright, so getting into the tips and tricks, we're going to start off with Pudica. So the tip I have with Pudica is that the monster you banish when it's off of its effect is actually special back. It does not return back. And what that important distinction means is that your trap cards are actually live when they bring something back from the banish zone. So for example, you can like hit them with a floodgate trap or something after you banish them with Pudica and they special summon something back. So it's important to remember. Next up with Myrmelio. Myrmelio is special summon effect is actually mandatory, so that means even if your opponent doesn't have a spell or trap, it still triggers regardless. And that can be important because it allows you to trigger Sarah on the first turn, essentially guaranteed when you special summon off of Sarah. So just keep that in mind. It's also not once per turn, so that means if your opponent's able to keep bringing back Myrmelio or summoning it through the deck, they're able to pop multiple spells and traps during the turn. Next up is Traptrix Mantis. So essentially Mantis's set effect to return a set spell or trap is important because when paired with a card like Dionea, which would otherwise banish it at the end of your next turn, you're able to return it to your hand and reset that restriction. But another important part about Mantis's effect is if you've set a trap hole off of Dionea or off of Sarah, your opponent actually knows where it's located. So being able to return it to your hand and then reset all your back row means your opponent knows you have access to that trap hole, but they don't know where it's set. And that can be really important if they have like singular spot removal like Cosmic Cyclone or something. Next up is Arachnocampa. So Arachnocampa actually, remember, locks you into insect and plant extra deck monsters. So that means you essentially can only make the Traptrix extra deck monsters. You can't go into like generic rank 4s or something the turn you special summon it out. But also it's a quick effect to actually special summon during the main phase. What that means is, for example, you can just set up like your regular Traptrix board and then hold this in hand. And if your opponent either doesn't know you have it, or something, and they go like, let's say, Harpy's Feather Duster, you can chain this to special summon it out, and then it protects your set cards from being destroyed once per turn. It also plays around a card like Nibiru, since you won't be committing as much on your turn, but also a card like Dark Ruler, because if you special summon this out on your board preemptively on your turn, your opponent just Dark Rulers, well, then your back row is vulnerable. But if you just keep the Arachnocampa in hand until you force them to use that spell and trap removal, then you're going to get so much more value off of the Arachnocampa. The next tip I'm going to give is about Terrifying Trap Hole Nightmare. Essentially, you may have remembered I mentioned earlier the trap holes don't really do anything to your opponent once their board is established, but perhaps this is like the one exception. The only condition is that if your opponent has special summoned any monster this turn, so that can be off of their own effect or off of like Pudica, you could like banish one and they special summon something back, then this card is just live for the entire turn. So the reason why that's important is because it gives you a better, it lets you use it more flexibly and gives you more freedom in the timing which you activate it. But also at the same time, it means now something like Rafflesia can actually be used as a spot removal card, since Terrifying Trap Hole Nightmare essentially can be used during any time that turn. So it's important to remember that Terrifying Trap Hole Nightmare can be considered like a removal card once your opponent has also summoned that monster. Next up is Holotea. So Holotea is actually also one of the key cards in this deck. You want to use it ideally on your very first turn to summon itself. That not only triggers Sarah, but gets it into rotation for your opponent's turn. Because I'm assuming you're linking it off or you're XYZ summoning with it. And then on your opponent's turn, its effect in the graveyard is going to be live to special summon back a card like Myrmelio or Pudica, and you have an extra disruption that way. And then essentially, once you summon back those monsters, you can trigger Sarah again to set another Holotea, and then do it all over again. So the great thing about Holotea essentially is, with Sarah, it essentially always gives you a rank 4, and then on the follow-up turn, well, if Holotea is in the graveyard, you're able to bring back any Traptrix to disrupt your opponent, and then trigger Sarah again to essentially set another trap. So it helps you chain Sarah effects like so many times, which is incredibly good. But remember, at the end of the day, it is one effect per turn and only once that turn. So you can't use both effects in the same turn, unfortunately. Next up is Rafflesia. Rafflesia, you need to remember that it actually protects your other Traptrix monsters, so they can't be targeted by card effects, they can't be destroyed by battle or card effects. The only thing they can target or destroy is Traptrix Rafflesia. So Rafflesia set up with like your smaller Traptrix monsters can be really good because your opponent has to kill this Rafflesia first, and that can be pretty difficult because Rafflesia has 2500 defense, which is pretty big. And then next up is Pingsula. So aside from its effect to search a monster, its other effect reads if a monster owned by your opponent is sent to the graveyard or banished by a card effect, then you're able to attach one of those monsters to this card as material. This is particularly good against the Albaz deck or the branded deck. The reason being their branded fusion is always sending cards to the graveyard. So that means if you're able to end on Pingicula, you're going to be able to take the Albaz once they send it to the graveyard. And that prevents them from essentially going into a card like Lubellion or Albion right away, for example, since this will be Chainlink 2 since it'd be your opponent's turn. You're able to take the Albaz, put it under, and then now your opponent just doesn't have access to Albaz, which is really huge against the branded deck because that essentially means they're stuck with that one fusion and they can't really do anything after that. And finally, just a quick general tip, something to remember, the small main deck Traptrix monsters are all unaffected by whole normal trap cards, and the extra deck Traptrix monsters are just in general unaffected by trap cards for the most part. The XYZs, I believe, they have to have material for them to be unaffected, but the point is, you can think of them as always being unaffected by traps, and the small main deck monsters as always being unaffected by whole normal trap cards. That makes it interesting in like a mirror match scenario where a lot of your trap pools just aren't really that good. So just keep that in mind. If you do end up playing the mirror match, like just put a little bit less emphasis on your trap cards and more emphasis on your monsters because that's how you're going to be winning the game. So that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you learned something new or if you think I missed something important. Please put it in the comment section below. But that being said, now that you've mastered Traptrix, hopefully you're able to play it better, you're able to beat it when you come across it. With that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.